Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Fractured Normal. Marshall Sheridan stood at his kitchen counter, pouring his second cup of coffee that Tuesday morning, watching his 8-year-old daughter Sophie push scrambled eggs around her plate. The October sunlight filtered through their suburban Denver home, but something felt off, a feeling that had been growing for weeks. "Not hungry, sweetheart?" Marshall asked, crouching beside her chair. Sophie's dark eyes flicked toward the hallway, where her mother Alicia was getting ready for work, then back to her plate. "My tummy hurts," she whispered. Marshall studied his daughter's face. Sophie had always been perceptive, almost unnervingly so. She noticed things, changes in tone, shifts in mood, the spaces between words. Lately, she'd been withdrawn, spending more time in her room, less time being the bright, curious kid who used to pepper him with questions about everything. "You can stay home if you're not feeling well," Marshall offered, but Sophie shook her head quickly. "I have to go. Mrs. Medina is teaching us about the solar system today." Alicia Sheridan emerged from the hallway, her auburn hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, phone pressed to her ear. "I know, Brian. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Yes, the Caldwell contracts are ready." She grabbed her briefcase without looking at Marshall or Sophie, air-kissed in their general direction, and headed for the garage. Marshall watched his wife leave, that knot in his stomach tightening. 6 months ago, Alicia had rekindled a friendship with Brian Faulkner, her childhood friend who'd moved back to Denver. Brian had positioned himself as a business consultant, and Alicia, who ran a successful real estate development firm, had brought him on as a partner. Since then, Marshall had watched his wife transform into someone he barely recognized. She'd become distant, erratic. Some nights, she'd come home energized but scattered, talking rapidly about ideas that made no sense. Other nights, she'd be exhausted, almost zombie-like. She'd forgotten Sophie's birthday dinner last month, something the old Alicia would never have done. Marshall had tried talking to her, suggesting she see a doctor, but she'd brushed him off, saying he was being paranoid. Marshall was an architectural historian. He restored historic buildings and consulted on preservation projects. His work required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to see patterns others missed. Those same skills were now telling him something was deeply wrong. After dropping Sophie at Maple Ridge Elementary, Marshall sat in his truck, watching her walk toward the entrance. She turned back once, giving him a small wave that looked almost like a goodbye. The gesture sent ice through his veins. His phone rang. "Marshall Sheridan." "Mr. Sheridan, this is Susan Liu, principal at Maple Ridge. There's been an incident with Sophie. She's locked herself in the second-floor bathroom and won't come out. She's been there for almost 2 hours now. We've tried everything." Marshall's heart hammered. "I'm on my way." Chapter 2. What was hidden? Marshall arrived at Maple Ridge Elementary to find Principal Liu pacing outside the second-floor bathroom, along with Sophie's teacher, Carrie Medina, and the school counselor, Renee Dennis. "Sophie, honey, it's Dad." Marshall called through the door, pressing his palm against the wood. "Can you open up for me?" "Dad." Sophie's small voice cracked. "Are you alone?" "Just me, sweetheart. Principal Liu and Mrs. Medina are here, but they can step back if you want. Don't let anyone call Mom." "Promise me, Dad." "Promise." Marshall's blood ran cold. He looked at Principal Liu and mouthed, "Everyone back." Once they'd moved down the hallway, he spoke again. "It's just me now. No one's calling Mom. I promise. But we need to get you out of there. It's been 6 hours, honey. You must be hungry and scared." The lock clicked. The door opened a crack, and Sophie's tear-streaked face appeared. Marshall squeezed through, closing the door behind him. His daughter launched into his arms, sobbing. "I found something, Daddy. Something bad. I didn't know what to do. I was scared to come home. I was scared Mom would find it." "Find what, Sophie?" Marshall held her close, his mind racing. Sophie pulled back and retrieved her unicorn backpack from a corner. With shaking hands, she unzipped the inner pocket and pulled out a small digital recording device, the kind journalists used, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag. "Where did you get this?" "From the study at home, in the bottom drawer of the desk. The one that's always locked, but I found where Mom hides the key. I heard them talking one night last week when I couldn't sleep." Mom and Mr. Faulkner. He said something about keeping her compliant, and the plan was working. I didn't understand, but it scared me. So I looked. Marshall's hands trembled as he took the device. Did you listen to it? Sophie nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. Some of it. There are lots of recordings, Daddy. Mr. Faulkner talking to different people. He says bad things. About Mom. About taking our house. About getting rid of you. The bathroom door suddenly shook. Mr. Sheridan, we need to resolve this. Principal Liu called. We're concerned about Sophie's welfare. If you don't come out in the next 5 minutes, we're bringing in Mr. Tran with a master key. Marshall looked at his daughter, then at the device in his hands. This was evidence of something, he didn't know what yet, but his instinct screamed that Sophie had stumbled onto something dangerous. Sophie, listen to me very carefully. When we go out there, I need you to let them think you were scared about something at school. Okay? A bully, maybe. Can you do that? Sophie nodded, understanding flickering in her intelligent eyes. She was her father's daughter. And give me your backpack. I'm going to hide this device in my jacket. They emerged from a bathroom to find Principal Liu, Mrs. Medina, Counselor Dennis, and now Herbert Tran, the janitor who'd been about to break down the door. Marshall had Sophie secured on his hip, and she buried her face in his shoulder. Sophie was having trouble with another student, Marshall said smoothly, meeting Principal Liu's concerned gaze. She was embarrassed and scared. We've talked about it, and I think it's best if I take her home for the rest of the day. We'll follow up on the bullying situation tomorrow. Principal Liu looked skeptical. Mr. Sheridan, this seems like more than a bullying incident. Sophie was in there for 6 hours. We should involve. My daughter confided in me, and I'm handling it, Marshall said firmly, but politely. Unless you have evidence of abuse or neglect, I'm taking her home. Now, the edge in his voice made Principal Liu step back. Of course, but we will need to follow up on this. Marshall signed Sophie out and carried her to his truck. Once inside with the doors locked, he pulled out the recording device. Sophie, you did something incredibly brave today. You might have saved our family, but I need you to promise me you won't tell anyone, not even Mom, about this until I figure out what's going on. Can you promise? I promise, Daddy. Sophie squeezed his hand. Are we in danger? Marshall looked at his daughter's frightened face and made a decision that would change everything. Not anymore. Daddy's going to fix this. But I need you to trust me and be brave a little while longer. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. Marshall settled Sophie at his workshop, a converted warehouse where he kept architectural models and restoration equipment. His assistant, a retired carpenter named Raymond Bray, was happy to watch her while she did homework. Ray, I need a few hours, Marshall said quietly. Keep an eye on her. Don't let anyone know she's here. Raymond, who'd worked with Marshall for 15 years, read the tension in his face and nodded. You got it, boss. Marshall drove to a surveillance equipment shop across town, purchased a high-quality audio interface and laptop, then parked in a coffee shop parking lot. His hands shook as he connected the recording device and began to listen. What he heard over the next 2 hours destroyed his understanding of the past 6 months and revealed a conspiracy so calculated, so evil, that his blood turned to ice. The earliest recordings dated back 7 months, right when Brian Faulkner had coincidentally returned to Denver. Brian's voice was smooth, confident, speaking to someone named Carlos Sears. The Sheridan woman is perfect, successful business, real assets, and completely trusting. Her husband's a nobody, some architectural historian who plays with old buildings. Once I have her under control, liquidating their assets will be simple. The prenup works in our favor. Everything she built is separate from his income. In the compound, Carlos's voice was rough, businesslike. I've been gradually increasing the dosage in her coffee. The cognitive effects are exactly as you described. Heightened suggestibility, memory gaps, emotional volatility. She thinks she's just stressed. In another month, she'll sign anything I put in front of her. Marshall paused the recording, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. Brian was drugging Alicia, systematically poisoning his wife to steal her business and their assets. He forced himself to continue listening. There were dozens of recordings, Brian had apparently kept detailed audio logs of his scheme, probably for leverage or insurance. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated con artist who'd researched the Sheridan family extensively. Brian had served time for financial fraud years ago under a different name. He'd reinvented himself, tracked down his old childhood friend Alicia, and engineered their chance reunion. He'd cultivated her trust, identified her insecurities about her business, positioned himself as her savior. But the most chilling recordings involved Brian's future plans. Once the business is transferred to the shell companies, we'll need to handle the husband. Nothing traceable. The wife will be so far gone by then, she'll barely remember him. Maybe a car accident. Make it look natural. Marshall's mind raced. Brian wasn't just stealing. He was planning murder. And Alicia, his brilliant, strong wife, was being systematically broken down by chemical manipulation. He kept listening. Sophie had been right to be terrified. There were recordings of Brian meeting with various accomplices. Carlos Sears, who supplied the drugs, a lawyer named Clarence Ball who helped set up fraudulent companies, and others. Brian had built an entire network to execute his plan. One recording from 3 weeks ago made Marshall's blood boil. The kid is becoming a problem. She watches me with these calculating eyes, like she knows something's wrong. If she becomes an obstacle, we'll have to address it. Brian had considered hurting Sophie. Marshall's little girl had been on this monster's radar. The last recording was from yesterday morning, in Marshall's own home. Tomorrow, I'm having Alicia sign the final transfer documents. By Friday, I'll control 70% of her business assets. The house will be in foreclosure by next month. I've already made sure she missed 3 mortgage payments. Marshall Sheridan won't know what hit him until he's got nothing left. Marshall sat in his truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. His entire world collapsed and rebuilt around this new terrible knowledge. But beneath the shock and rage, something cold and analytical began to take shape. Brian Faulkner thought he was smart. He thought he'd planned everything perfectly, but he'd made critical mistakes. First, he'd underestimated Sophie, and by extension, Marshall. He'd seen Marshall as some ineffectual academic who wouldn't notice his life being stolen until it was too late. Second, Brian had kept detailed recordings of his crimes, probably thinking they made him untouchable. In reality, he documented his own downfall. Third, and most importantly, Brian didn't understand the kind of man Marshall Sheridan actually was. Marshall had built his career on patience, precision, and understanding how structures, whether buildings or systems, could be dismantled and rebuilt. He knew how to see patterns, exploit weaknesses, and restore things to their proper form. Brian Faulkner had waged war on Marshall's family. Now Marshall would show him what real planning looked like. He called his lawyer, an old friend named Gabriel Price, who specialized in criminal defense. Gabe, I need you to come to my workshop. Now, don't call ahead, don't tell anyone, and bring paperwork for a restraining order and criminal conspiracy charges. I've got recordings that will blow your mind. Marshall, what? My wife is being poisoned by her business partner who's planning to kill me and steal everything we own. I have full audio evidence. We need to move fast and smart. Can you come? There was a brief pause. Then Gabriel's voice turned professional and sharp. I'm 15 minutes away. Marshall started his truck. As he drove back to his workshop, his mind was already constructing the framework of his response. This wouldn't be a simple matter of going to the police. That was too direct, too risky. Brian had accomplices, resources, and obviously didn't fear consequences. No, Marshall needed to do this differently. He needed to dismantle Brian's entire operation, expose every accomplice, protect his family, and ensure that the man who tried to destroy them would face consequences so complete that he'd never threaten anyone again. The husband, the father, the protector in Marshall Sheridan had fully awakened. And Brian Faulkner was about to learn that the most dangerous enemy is the one you've underestimated. Chapter 4. The Web of Lies. Gabriel Price sat in Marshall's workshop office, headphones on, listening to the recordings for the second time. His expression had progressed from skeptical to horrified to coldly furious. When he finally removed the headphones, he looked at Marshall with new respect. This is This is one of the most calculated predatory schemes I've seen in 20 years of practice, Gabriel said. Brian Faulkner is a professional. These recordings document felony conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and drugging. We have enough here to put him away for decades. But, Marshall asked, reading his friend's hesitation. But we have to be strategic. If we go straight to the police with this, Faulkner might have connections we don't know about. He could flee or destroy evidence. We need to secure Alicia's safety first, get her medical attention to flush whatever he's been giving her, and simultaneously gather evidence on his accomplices. I'm ahead of you, Marshall said, spreading documents across the desk. I've spent the last 3 hours researching. Brian Faulkner isn't his real name. It's Brian Faulkner now, but he was born Brian Faulkner. He did 8 years for securities fraud in California under his birth name. Changed it legally 6 years ago when he got out. Gabriel leaned forward, studying the documents. How did you find this? I called in a favor from an old college roommate who works in criminal records research. Once I had his real identity, the rest came together. Brian's worked this scam before. He targets successful women, gains their trust, drugs them, and systematically steals their assets. There's a woman in Sacramento named Teresa Bond who lost her medical practice to a scam identical to this. She's still trying to rebuild her life. Authorities never had enough evidence to pin it on Brian. Until now, Gabriel said, a grim smile crossing his face. Until now, Marshall agreed. But here's what I'm thinking. Going to the police is step one, not the whole plan. I want to hurt him in ways the legal system can't touch. I want every one of his accomplices exposed. I want him to lose everything the way he tried to make us lose everything. Gabriel studied his friend carefully. Marshall, I understand the anger, but I'm not talking about anything illegal, Marshall interrupted. I'm talking about methodical, strategic destruction. This man researched my family for months. He has networks, resources, people who enable his predation. I want all of it exposed and dismantled. The legal case is just the foundation. Raymond Bray knocked on the office door. Boss, your wife just called the workshop line. Said she's looking for Sophie. Wants to know if she's with you. Sounded off. Marshall and Gabriel exchanged looks. What did you tell her? Said I hadn't seen Sophie. She hung up without saying goodbye. Marshall's jaw tightened. Alicia was looking for their daughter because Brian had probably asked her to. The recordings had mentioned Brian's concern about Sophie. He must have sensed something was wrong when she locked herself in the bathroom. We need to move faster, Marshall said. Ray, can you take Sophie to your place tonight? Tell your wife, Melissa, it's an emergency, and keep Sophie off all devices. No phone, no tablet, nothing Brian could track. Raymond nodded. Consider it done. Melissa loves that kid anyway. After Raymond left with Sophie, Marshall turned back to Gabriel. Here's the plan. You file the police report tonight with the recordings and my research. I want a warrant issued for Brian's arrest, search warrants for his home and office, and a restraining order keeping him away from Alicia and Sophie. Can you make that happen? With this evidence? Absolutely. But Marshall, where will you be? I'm going home to get my wife away from that monster and into a hospital. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Marshall arrived home at 7:47 p.m. to find Alicia's car in the driveway and lights on throughout the house. His heart hammered as he entered through the front door. Alicia sat at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes, staring at her phone with glassy eyes. She looked up when Marshall entered, and he barely recognized the woman before him. His vibrant, sharp-witted wife looked hollow, her movements sluggish. Where's Sophie? Alicia asked, her voice flat. She's safe, Marshall said carefully, sitting across from her. Alicia, we need to talk. When's the last time you ate something? Brian said Sophie was acting strange at school today. He's worried about her. He thinks she might have found. Alicia trailed off, confusion crossing her face. What was I saying? Marshall's hands clenched into fists under the table. Seeing his wife like this, drug, manipulated, turned into a puppet, ignited a fury so deep it was almost blinding. But he forced himself to remain calm. Alicia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Brian Faulkner has been poisoning you. For months. He's been putting drugs in your coffee to make you suggestible and confused so he can steal your business. Alicia blinked slowly, processing his words with obvious difficulty. That doesn't make sense. Brian is my friend. He's helping me. He's destroying you, Marshall said firmly, pulling out his phone and playing one of the recordings. Brian's voice filled the kitchen. The Sheridan woman is perfect. Successful business, real assets, and completely trusting. As the recording played, Marshall watched his wife's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, dawning horror, and finally, a flicker of the real Alicia breaking through the fog. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not. We've been friends since childhood." He wouldn't. Marshall played another clip. "I've been gradually increasing the dosage in her coffee. The cognitive effects are exactly as you described. Heightened suggestibility, memory gaps, emotional volatility." Alicia's hands shook. She looked at Marshall with tears streaming down her face. "How long?" 6, maybe 7 months. Since he came back to Denver. "My coffee," Alicia said, her voice breaking. He always brought me coffee in the morning at the office. Special blend from this cafe, he knew. I thought he was being nice. Oh God, Marshall, what has he done to me? What have I done?" Marshall moved around the table and pulled his wife into his arms. She collapsed against him, sobbing. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "But right now, I need you to trust me. I need to take you to the hospital. They need to run blood work, flush whatever he's been giving you out of your system." "The business," Alicia choked out. "He made me sign papers. Yesterday. I couldn't think straight, but he kept insisting and I signed them. Marshall, I think I signed over control of the company. We'll get it back," Marshall promised, though inside his rage grew even colder. "Everything he's taken, we'll get back. But first, your health." A car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Marshall saw Brian Faulkner getting out of the silver Mercedes, his expression concerned, manipulative mask perfectly in place. "He's here," Alicia whispered, fear sharp in her voice. "Stay behind me," Marshall commanded, positioning himself between his wife and the door. Brian knocked, then used a key Marshall hadn't known he had, to open the front door. He stepped inside, his handsome face arranged in an expression of friendly concern that made Marshall's skin crawl. "Alicia, I've been trying to reach you," Brian said smoothly. "I'm worried about Sophie. The principal called me, listed as your emergency contact, and said there was an incident. Is everything?" His eyes landed on Marshall, and something flickered in his expression. "Fear." "Marshall, I didn't expect you to be home." "I bet you didn't," Marshall said, his voice deadly calm. "But here I am, and we need to talk about the business you've been conducting with my wife." Brian's mask slipped for just a second, revealing cold calculation underneath. "I don't know what you're implying, but—" "Cut the act," Marshall interrupted. "I know everything. The drugs, the theft, your real name, your criminal record, the Sacramento job with Teresa Bond. All of it." The air in the room turned arctic. Brian's friendly expression vanished entirely, replaced with something reptilian and dangerous. "You've been busy, clever. I underestimated you." "Your last mistake," Marshall said. "Is it?" Brian's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. "You see, Marshall, you've put me in a difficult position. I've invested months in this project. I'm not walking away empty-handed." Marshall registered the threat and moved. His years of physical labor on restoration sites had kept him strong and fast. He closed the distance between them before Brian could pull whatever was in his pocket, grabbed his wrist, and twisted hard. Something clattered to the floor, a syringe filled with clear liquid. "Did you really think you'd inject me with something in my own home?" Marshall growled, shoving Brian back against the wall. Brian sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. My associates are about to be arrested," Marshall finished. "Police have everything. Recordings, documentation, all of it. Your operation is done." As if on cue, red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Police cars pulled into the driveway, followed by an unmarked sedan. Gabriel Price got out of one vehicle, detectives from the other. Detective Angela Eddy, whom Marshall had met during a previous restoration project at the police headquarters, entered with her partner Herbert Tran. "Brian Faulkner, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, and about 8 other charges I'm going to enjoy reading to you." As they cuffed Brian, he looked at Marshall with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started." "No," Marshall said quietly. "You have no idea what you've started. But you're about to find out." Chapter 6, The Foundation. The next 48 hours were a controlled hurricane of activity. Alicia spent the first day in the hospital, where doctors confirmed significant levels of benzodiazepines and other compounds in her system, a cocktail designed to impair judgment without completely incapacitating her. The medical team started a detoxification protocol. Marshall barely left her side, except when meeting with Gabriel and the police. Detective Eddie had taken the case personally once she understood its scope. "We've arrested Carlos Sears, the guy who supplied the drugs," she told Marshall in the hospital cafeteria. "He's rolling over on everyone to save his own skin. We've also got Clarence Ball, the lawyer who set up the shell companies. He's trying to claim he didn't know it was fraudulent, but the recordings contradict that." "What about the money?" Marshall asked. "Alicia signed over nearly $1 million in assets. We've frozen all the accounts. Your wife's signatures were obtained under duress and chemical impairment. Any halfway decent lawyer could invalidate them, and you've got Gabriel Price, so you're in good shape. The assets will be returned, though it might take some time to untangle." Marshall nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The legal system would handle Brian's criminal prosecution, and that was important. But it wasn't enough. Brian had allies, networks, probably resources stashed away. Men like him always had contingencies. Marshall needed to ensure Brian's destruction was total, not just legally, but socially, financially, and psychologically. He needed Brian to understand what it felt like to have everything stripped away by someone you'd underestimated. Over the next week, as Alicia slowly recovered and Sophie settled back into a careful routine, Marshall executed the second phase of his plan. He discovered that Brian's entire operation was funded by previous victims who'd never fully recovered their assets. Brian had offshore accounts, shell companies, and a network of enablers who believed he was untouchable. Marshall reached out to Teresa Bond in Sacramento, the medical practice owner Brian had victimized years earlier. When she heard what Marshall had done, she wept. "You have no idea what this means," Teresa said over the phone. "I tried for years to get someone to listen, to investigate. I lost everything. My practice, my reputation, my savings. Brian destroyed my life. Help me destroy his," Marshall said. "I need to know everyone he's hurt. Every victim, every associate, every person who's enabled him. We're building a case that goes beyond criminal charges. I want civil suits, publicity, professional ruin. I want his entire network exposed." Teresa agreed immediately. So did 4 other women Marshall tracked down, all victims of Brian's previous schemes. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance, coordinated by Gabriel Price and supported by Detective Eddie, who saw the potential for a landmark case against financial predators. But Marshall had one more component to his plan, and it was the most dangerous: confronting Brian directly. 3 weeks after Brian's arrest, he posted bail. Apparently, he still had access to hidden funds and high-powered attorneys. Marshall had been waiting for this. He arranged to meet Brian at a neutral location, a closed restaurant Marshall was restoring downtown. Brian arrived with his lawyer, thinking this was a negotiation. Marshall sat alone at a dusty table, blueprints and architectural plans spread before him. "This is unexpected," Brian said, his lawyer, a slick operator named Nicholas Harrington, at his side. "My client assumed any communication would go through official channels." "This isn't a legal discussion," Marshall said calmly. "This is informational." Brian wanted to know what he'd started. "I'm here to tell him." Brian's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Marshall pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Inside, you'll find documentation of every victim you've ever targeted. 23 women over 15 years. Each one is now part of a coordinated civil lawsuit against you, seeking damages totaling $47 million. Your offshore accounts? Frozen. Your shell companies? Being dismantled. Your network of enablers? all facing their own charges. Brian's face paled as he flipped through the documents. But that's just the legal framework, Marshall continued. I've also contacted every major news outlet in 5 states. Your story is running tomorrow morning. Your face will be plastered across television, newspapers, and the internet. Every single crime, every victim, every detail. You'll be the poster child for financial predators. You can't, Nicholas started, but Marshall cut him off. I already have. But here's the beautiful part, Brian. The part one want you to truly understand. You thought you were predators hunting sheep. You thought my wife was weak, that I was insignificant, that you could take everything and face no consequences. You were wrong about all of it. Marshall stood, gathering his blueprints. In my work, I restore structures by understanding how they're built and where their weaknesses lie. Then I systematically reinforce them or, when necessary, carefully dismantle them. I've applied that same methodology to your entire life, Brian. Every structure you built to protect yourself, every relationship you thought was secure, every resource you thought was hidden, I found them all. And I took them apart piece by piece. This is harassment, Nicholas said weakly. We'll sue for. For what? Marshall asked. Telling the truth? Coordinating victims' legal rights? I've done nothing illegal. I've simply done what you did, researched, planned, and executed. The difference is my foundation is built on justice, not cruelty. Marshall walked to the door, then paused. You're going to prison, Brian. But even after you serve your time, you'll have nothing to come back to. No reputation, no resources, no network. Every single thing you stole, every person you hurt, every system you exploited, it's all being corrected. You wanted to destroy my family. Instead, you handed me the tools to destroy you. As Marshall left, he heard Brian's chair scrape back, heard the man who'd seemed so confident and untouchable begin to understand the true scope of his downfall. The next morning, the story broke nationwide. Marshall's phone rang constantly. Media requests, messages of support, interview offers. He declined them all. This wasn't about glory or attention. This was about protecting his family and ensuring a predator could never hunt again. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. The trial of Brian Faulkner began on a cold January morning, 4 months after Sophie had locked herself in that school bathroom. The courtroom was packed with victims, journalists, and observers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Marshall sat in the gallery with Alicia, who'd made a remarkable recovery. The fog had lifted from her mind, replaced with a steely determination to see Brian face justice. Sophie was with Raymond and Melissa Bray, intentionally kept away from the proceedings to protect her from media attention. But Marshall had one more card to play, something he kept carefully hidden even from Gabriel Price. District Attorney Christoph Murray was prosecuting, and he was methodical, building the case piece by piece. The recordings Sophie had found were the foundation, but Marshall's investigative work had uncovered so much more. Bank records, testimonies from other victims, forensic evidence of the drugging, documentation of the shell companies. It was overwhelming. Brian's defense team, led by Nicholas Harrington, tried to paint their client as a businessman who'd made mistakes, whose actions were exaggerated by a vengeful husband. It was a losing strategy, but they had no better option. On the 4th day of trial, Marshall received a text from Detective Eddie. Need to talk. Urgent. They met in a coffee shop near the courthouse. Angela looked troubled. We have a problem, she said. Brian's been making calls from jail. We've been monitoring, but he's been careful, using legal privilege conversations with his attorneys to pass messages. We think he's arranging something. Like what? Retaliation. He has associates we haven't found yet. People loyal to him or scared enough to do what he asks. We've increased security around you and your family. But Marshall, you need to be careful. Marshall nodded, having expected something like this. Men like Brian didn't go down quietly. Thanks for the warning. But I think Brian's about to have bigger problems. Angela frowned. What do you mean? You'll see. Today. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called its next witness. Carlos Sears, the drug supplier who'd taken a plea deal. Carlos testified about supplying Brian with various compounds designed to impair cognitive function without obvious physical symptoms. And did Mr. Faulkner tell you why he needed these substances? Christoph Murray asked. He said he needed to control targets, make them compliant. He talked about it like it was a business strategy, like drugging people was just another tool. The courtroom murmured. Brian sat stone-faced at the defense table, but Marshall could see the tension in his shoulders. Then came a surprise testimony. Gabriel Price stood and announced, "Your Honor, the people called Dr. Shelley Grady." Dr. Grady was a forensic psychiatrist who'd examined Brian at Marshall's request, paid for privately, outside the official case. She'd spent hours with Brian during a court-ordered evaluation, and her testimony was devastating. In my professional opinion, Mr. Faulkner exhibits clear markers of psychopathy, Dr. Grady testified. He shows no genuine remorse, demonstrates manipulative behavior, and views other people as objects to be used. His journal entries, which were seized during the search of his apartment, reveal a deep-seated belief that he's superior to his victims and entitled to take from them. And these journal entries, Christoph Murray said, what do they reveal about his future intentions? He documented plans for at least 6 more targets. He viewed his arrest as a temporary setback, not a stopping point. In his own words, he wrote, "Eventually I'll walk out of this. And when I do, the Sheridans will understand what real revenge looks like." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Marshall watched Brian's face go through a rapid series of expressions, shocked that his private journals had been found, rage that they were being used against him, and finally, a cold calculation as he realized the trap had fully closed. But Marshall wasn't done. That evening, after court adjourned, Brian was returned to his cell to find a package waiting. It was from Marshall, approved by the jail as non-threatening mail. Inside was a single piece of paper, a blueprint, but not of a building. It was a diagram of Brian's entire operation, every connection, every crime, every person involved, labeled, documented, complete, and at the bottom, in Marshall's architectural, drafting handwriting, "This is what you built. This is what I demolished. Piece by piece. Foundation to roof. You wanted to be the architect of other people's destruction. I showed you what a real architect can do. Enjoy your new life in the structure you created for yourself." Guards reported that Brian stared at the document for hours, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened to him. Chapter 8. The Verdict. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning. Brian's defense collapsed under the weight of his own documented crimes. But Marshall's real victory came during the victim impact statements. 23 women stood before the court, one by one, and described what Brian had done to them, not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. Teresa Bond spoke of years of therapy, of rebuilding from nothing, of the nightmares that still haunted her. Alicia Sheridan was the last to speak. Marshall watched his wife, strong, brilliant, fully recovered, stand before the man who tried to destroy her. "You targeted me because you thought I was weak," Alicia said, her voice steady. "Because I was kind, because I trusted an old friend, because I believed in redemption. You saw those qualities as vulnerabilities to exploit. You drugged me, manipulated me, tried to steal everything I'd built, and planned to kill my husband. You threatened my daughter." She paused, looking directly at Brian. "But you failed. Not because the police caught you, though they did. Not because the legal system worked, though it is. You failed because you underestimated the strength of the people you tried to destroy. My husband didn't just stop you. He dismantled everything you built. He protected our family and 23 other families you'd hurt or planned to hurt. You wanted to be the predator. Instead, you became the lesson." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict came back unanimous on all counts. Guilty. Brian was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His associates received varying sentences. His assets, what few could be recovered, were divided among his victims. But Marshall knew the real sentence was everything else. Brian's reputation was destroyed beyond repair, his networks dismantled, his future obliterated. Even after prison, he'd be a registered offender, watched, restricted, marked. The architect of so much cruelty would spend the rest of his life in the structure he'd built for others. Outside the courthouse, Marshall declined all media interviews except one. He made a brief statement. This case isn't just about one predator. It's about systems that allow people like Bryan Faulkner to operate, about victims who aren't believed, about the work it takes to achieve real justice. My family was lucky. We had resources, knowledge, and most importantly, my daughter's bravery. But there are countless families who don't have those advantages. We need to do better laws, better protections, better support for victims. Then he took his wife's hand, collected Sophie from the berets, and went home. Chapter 9. Restoration. 3 months later, the Sheridan family sat in their backyard on a warm spring evening. Sophie played with her dog, a golden retriever they'd adopted as part of her recovery process. Alicia read a book, her business fully restored and thriving. Marshall tended his garden, a new hobby he'd taken up to manage stress. "Dad," Sophie called, running over. Mrs. Medina said, "I can do a presentation on architecture for the school career day. Will you help me?" Marshall smiled, pulling his daughter onto his lap. "Of course. What do you want to focus on?" "Restoration," Sophie said seriously. "How you take broken things and make them beautiful again." Marshall looked at his daughter, this remarkable child who'd been brave enough to hide evidence, smart enough to recognize danger, and strong enough to help save her family. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Restoration is all about understanding what something was meant to be, removing the damage, and rebuilding the foundation so it's even stronger than before." Alicia looked up from her book, meeting Marshall's eyes with a smile that held all their shared history. The crisis they'd survived, the strength they'd discovered, the future they'd rebuilt. "It's also about knowing which structures are worth saving," Alicia added, "and which ones need to be torn down completely." That evening, after Sophie went to bed, Marshall and Alicia sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Do you think he understands yet?" Alicia asked quietly. "What he lost?" "Probably," Marshall said. "Men like Bryan always think they're the smartest person in the room. But intelligence without wisdom, planning without conscience, it builds structures that can't stand." He built his life on exploiting others. When that foundation cracked, everything came down. "And what did you build it on?" Alicia asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Marshall thought about the question, about the weeks of investigation, the careful planning, the methodical dismantling of Bryan's networks, about the risks he'd taken, the choices he'd made, the line he'd walked between justice and revenge. "I built it on protecting what matters," he finally said. "Family, truth, making sure that people who hurt others face real consequences. Not just legal ones, but the kind that fundamentally change what's possible for them." Bryan wanted to be a predator. I made sure he'd never hunt again. Inside the house, Sophie's night light glowed softly. The family dog settled onto his bed. The house, their home, nearly stolen, now reclaimed, stood solid and secure. Marshall Sheridan had started as a man who restored old buildings, who worked with patience and precision to preserve history. But when his family was threatened, he discovered he could apply those same skills to a different kind of restoration, dismantling those who preyed on others and rebuilding the safety they tried to destroy. The legal battle was over. Bryan Faulkner would spend the next quarter-century in prison, his reputation destroyed, his networks scattered, his future erased. The other victims were recovering, supported by settlements and resources Marshall had helped secure. But more importantly, Marshall's family was whole again. Alicia was thriving, back to her brilliant self. Sophie was healing, secure in the knowledge that her father would always protect her. And Marshall himself had learned something fundamental about his own strength. Not physical power, but the careful, methodical capability to face threats and neutralize them completely. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not because the danger was over, but because he knew, had proven, that he had the tools, the intelligence, and the determination to protect what he loved. Bryan Faulkner had tried to destroy the Sheridan family's foundation. Instead, he'd given Marshall the opportunity to show just how strong that foundation really was. And in the end, that was the most complete victory of all. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.